Two small caveats before you watch the video. First, English is not my maternal language, so I might mispronounce a thing or two, but subtitles should be available and there's a link in the description to the text of the episode if it can help. Second, we're gonna talk about Crash Course Mythology, and we're gonna mention things that they don't talk about. But given it's an ongoing series, it's entirely possible that by the time I edit this video, they will have mentioned it, or that they will mention it in the future. So I might be spoiling Crash Course Mythology for you is all I'm saying. But in the eventuality that those things are outside the scope of their show, we might as well talk about it. I think it will only add to the discussion. So, let's go. Plagiarism is a big issue today in academia and beyond. The internet made it both a stronger temptation and harder to get away with. And many students are understandably puzzled by some of the rules of citation. And can you blame them? I mean, plagiarism is also a big deal among professors and apparently higher-ranking US officials. And as for religious studies, recently Riza Aslan, everyone's favorite bowl of room-tempered water, was accused of stealing someone else's scholarship on Santa Muerte without due citation. And he claimed there was nothing original about said research and did not entail any intellectual property. And that's always the problem, isn't it? If something is common knowledge, well, it's a fact, and you cannot put a copyright on a fact. In religious studies, of course, when we deal with stories or practices sometimes shared for centuries, it's obvious that they're in the public domain. But scholarship about those things, translations of stories, account of rituals, theories, all those things still involve somebody's work, so when you rely on them you should acknowledge their work and cite it properly to give proper credit and proper context to your claims. That should go without saying, so I was a bit disappointed when I found out that the recent Crash Course series on mythology relied heavily on and often quoted verbatim some authors without mentioning it. And I thought we could discuss in what way it's a problem and maybe in what way it's not a problem. I have to admit I'm always skeptical of Malthite's bites of analysis, and common portrayal of mythology is essentially shallow because of some love for an endless quest for similarities and ascribing them deeper meaning. But it can be done right. The channel Religion for Breakfast, in my opinion, manages to make short, interesting and accessible interventions on religious matters, but he's a student in religious studies, so he's accustomed to the methodological problems of the field, while they're not necessarily at Crash Course. From what I can discern, their expertise lies rather in the fields of literature or drama criticism, and as we'll see, the authors they draw from are not that good either. While watching the preview, I feared we would delve in the dreary field of the world theologians, as I call them, you know, those guys like Relied, Jung or Joseph Campbell, who use mythology as some sort of fuel for their own spirituality and manage to analyze a myth or two in the meantime. But their first episode was good, I think. The myth of Persephone, the explicative function of myth, Taylor theory, it's all good. I was down for this. Like a few examples, different schools of analysis each week. Why not? It could be a great doorway into the complex study of myth. Episode 2 had a lot more myths listed, so I thought that I'd go look for the sources of these and maybe different translations and interpretations and the like. My main aim was to do some sort of commentary for the show, to use their video as a support, to talk maybe in greater detail about the stories evoked, and I still intend to do that. But it was hindered by the fact that they were somewhat reluctant to give the origin of the text quoted. Like, they admit this is one Egyptian creation myth among many, but don't give the source. And I'm not a specialist of ancient Egypt, so I just googled the quote and found out that it's spell 307 from the Egyptian coffin texts, apparently in a translation by Clark in 1959. Faulkner's 2004 translation is a bit different and less dramatic, but that's expected. But why a translation from the 50s, though? Well, because they copied it, and pretty much every example in this episode, from a chapter in David Leeming's book, The World of Myth. The account of the Genesis creation myth is given by Leeming with the same translation. Hesiod's theogony is there too, although the translation is different, but in an episode about creation myth, those two were pretty much a given. The Popol Vuh is in Leeming's book, but the wording comes clearly from Virginia Hamilton's book, In the Beginning, Creation Stories from All Around the World. Hamilton is, according to her website, America's most honored writer of children's literature, and to their credit, it seems Crash Course altered the wording a bit to summarize. Since I think they will talk about the Popol Vuh again in the future, we'll leave it out for now. The text for the Kono creation myth also comes from Hamilton, as you can see.
In one creation myth from the Kono people of Guinea, the darkness before creation is inhabited by Death, his wife, and his daughter. In the beginning, there was darkness, and in it lived Death, called Sa, with his wife and daughter. The three of them were all that was. There was nowhere for them to live comfortably, so Sa started it. He used his magic power and he made an endless mud sea. In this mud place, Sa built his house. After that, the god Alatangana came to visit Sa. He found Sa's house dirty and dark. Alatangana thought Sa should do better than that, and he said so. Nothing can live in such a place, the god told Sa. This house needs fixing up. Everything is too dark. So Alatangana thought he'd better take things in hand. He made the mud solid. We now know it as earth. The earth feels sad, God said. I will make plants and animals to live on it. So he did. And
in the end, they tried the edgy-ass hot take, the Big Bang is a myth.
Before we leave the realm of ex nihilo creation, I want to give one more example. The Big Bang. Here, we're going to use a version related by Brian Swim in his book, The Universe is a Green Dragon. Imagine that furnace out of which everything came forth.
Oh, that's funny. You know who else quoted The Universe is a Green Dragon in a chapter about the ex nihilo creation myth? The same single book! And while they do cite some of Leeming's sources, cutting the middleman, Leeming himself does not elicit a mention. Well, this is obviously where they found it. Well, one of his other books is quoted exactly once.
Fortunately, for people like me, there's a word to describe the condition before creation: chaos, which mythologist David Leeming defines as the primal void or state of uniform non-differentiation that precedes the creation of the world in most creation myths.
So you get the impression that this is a quote and that the rest are, I don't know, various translations gathered by the devoted Crash Course team on their own, but all their examples are quoted directly from Leeming or Hamilton. That's weird. I asked the writer Raoul Meyer about it, and he was kind enough to respond, telling me that his drafts always contain footnotes referencing what he borrows from. Also, he uses a different edition of Leeming than the one I have, which might explain the different translations. But it confirmed that his main source was Introductory Mythology 101 books, which comes with a few predicaments, as we will see. And I'm not gonna explain to Crash Course how to manage their successful money-making YouTube channel, okay? I don't think that I'm in any position to do so from my little French channel that virtually nobody watches. And I'm not blaming anyone involved. Like, Crash Course is a factory, so if you want to churn out one episode a week for 50 weeks trying to cover all the mythologies of the world, you will sacrifice exactly the same things. The writer has to keep it under 5 pages, so he just puts a few footnotes in there, and anyway it will be cut by the editor because you don't want to bore the public with a list of books, and you fill the rest with jokey jokes. Why do more research if you won't be able to fit it in there? You might as well take a chapter from one of these books, do a few tweaks, rather than starting from scratch for a very similar end result. So that's going to be Crash Course Mythology. I mean, with that rhythm, they don't really have the luxury to do rewrites. It's not really going to change, and I'm okay with it. I'm not asking them to change. But as a more general policy, there's something they could do as an educational channel. That is what we opened with, citing their sources. And no, I don't want them to take 10 minutes of the video to do a rundown of their bibliography and methodology, but for books we invented something to cite a source without interrupting the reader. That is, a footnote. I think they could adapt the concept to a video. Just place a panel of text with the citation at the bottom of the video, with your source and the secondary reference where you found it. I know you can do it. Like, you do it for jokes. Like when you introduce a famous thinker, there's always those weird one-liners, and in your openings there are those little informative captions that apparently 300 people post to read. So this is disgraceful. But you can do it and make it look good. I know you can. But Laze, you'll tell me probably mispronouncing my name, in that case won't it be weird citing the same book over and over again?
Yes, that's the point. Citing your sources isn't about showing off how much reading you've done, nor is it a trick that makes you impervious to criticism. It's about honesty. It's about letting your audience know where your discourse is coming from and what its limitations are. And of course, no, I don't want crash course to go and travel the world and collect all the mythologies in the world by themselves from scratch. That would be ridiculous. They can use dictionaries of mythology, they can use encyclopedias of religion, they can use general secondary reference work, that's perfectly fine, they can use whatever they like. But when they do use them, they should cite them and mention them, because first, it spares you a lot of work, so you might as well be honest. Second, for the people in your audience that want to go further, it will spare them a lot of work if they knew where you drew the information. And third, because by relying on them, your video shares their weaknesses, as we will see in a minute.
And in their 6th video, they added their sources to the description, so thanks, it's a small thing, but I really think it's important. And they even have some informative panels of text to add information, so it seems they can and will do better. And I welcome that, and I'm excited to see where they're going next. So that's about giving proper credit. What about the context? What is exactly lost in the process? So if the wording of this Kono creation myth comes from Hamilton, what is its source? When, where, and by whom was it collected? It seems Hamilton took it in a 1966 book by Uli Beyer, The Origin of Life and Death, African Creation Myth. It's a short account, 4 pages. It's in Hamilton's bibliography, and she explicitly says that she was granted permission to reproduce this story. And the text is a little bit different, so I think that she retold the version that was in Beyer, adding dialogues and some descriptions to make it more living, if you will. It's so weird that she would cite her sources and ask for the permission to reproduce them. And you know what? Beyer himself is citing his sources. Well, actually no. He just says that it's a Kono story and lists all of the authors on which he relied at the start without saying which myth comes from which author. But I went through their respective writings, and the one that especially dealt with Kono culture is B. Hollas, or rather Bohumil Théophile Hollas, who wrote in French, which is expected given Guinea was a French colony. And indeed, he was the one that collected that myth in 1950 from a man named Nonlo Nyenemu, native of Gbakore, an important village of the Lola County, after giving him a white kola nut as is customary when you're asking for a sacred story. So those sentences that Crash Course quoted as if they were told by Alatangana, as if it's a direct quotation from the dialogue of Alatangana in this myth, it's not a translation from the Kono language to English. It's a Kono tale that was told in Kono, I think, since Hollas is giving the Kono translation for some words. It was then written in French, before being translated into English, then retold in English by a professional writer. It's quoted like it's in between quotes, but those words are Virginia Hamilton's, which makes it both more problematic from the copyright side of things, given it's a more creative retelling, and further from the original version, if you wish. And to be honest, that's why you see that Hamilton is a writer, because her version is way better, it's more dramatic and better written, so you can see why Crash Course chose to quote her. But lies, you'll tell me, mispronouncing my name again, aren't you a bit contradictory? You criticize Crash Course for not making enough effort to retell the story they're using, but then you claim that retellings have no value? Well, retellings and summaries have value, but they might reflect more the mindset of the people retelling the story than the original material. Like there's a difference between quoting the Bible and quoting Paradise Lost by Milton. Both can be interesting, and Paradise Lost was an influential work in its own right, but it's not the same thing. And it might be a small thing, but in Hollas and Beyer's translation, everything in the beginning is in the indirect discourse. Those are not lines spoken by Alatangana as such, even if the message is pretty much the same. You might say that it is a really small thing, and it is a really small thing, but it is a symptom of all the things you will lose in translation. For example, in the 1954 version, Hollas transcribed Death's name as Ha, saying that it's pronounced like an S, but really deep in the throat. Like I don't really know. In all later version, like the 1975 one that we used, he kept sa, as did his translators. But that seems like it's relevant, if only phonetically. And while it's obviously the same core story, there are a few slight differences in each of Hollas's versions, implying some degree of retelling on his part. And even when the text is pretty faithful, some misunderstandings can arise. For example, Crash Course's animation team showed a house lighting up as Alatangana claims it is too dark. so you get the impression that Alatangana brings light to a dark universe, as do some other creator gods cited in this episode. But in this story, light only comes into play later. And furthermore, I'd argue it gives you a false impression of Alatangana's role, since he's not the one that brings light into the world, but death. So, since Crash Course only tells the beginning of the story, we might look at how light appears in this myth, given it's after an interesting story about black people and white people that we're gonna look at now. So Alatangana wants to marry Sa's daughter, but her father ends up refusing, so they got married in secret and fled to a remote corner of the earth. They lived happily and had many children, 7 boys and 7 girls, among which each time 4 were white and 3 were black. But these children spoke languages that neither their father nor their mother could understand, so Alatangana had to reluctantly ask Sa for help. And he told him, "Yes, it is I who punished you for offending me. You will never understand what your children are saying. But I'll give to your white sons intelligence, Kli, and paper to write, Sebela, so they can write down their thoughts. To your black sons, so that they may feed themselves and procure for themselves all they need, I'll give them the hoe, Kali, the axe, Yugbo, and the machete, Gbiye." And before letting him go, Sa recommended to Alatangana to make sure that his white children marry only among themselves and that their black children do the same. And after those marriages, they dispersed across the world and gave birth to the white and black races. From those ancestors were then born the innumerable children that we know today under the names of French, English, Germans, Italians, etc. on one side, and under the names of Kono, Guerze, Manon, Malinke, Toma, Yakuba, etc. on the other. And it's only after that Alatangana has to ask Sa about, getting light in this dark universe, because there is no sun, moon, or stars yet. But since he's afraid to talk to him, he sends the tutu and the rooster, Tessine, to ask Sa about it, and he tells them in return, "Go back home, I will bestow singing upon you, and by singing you will call forth the light of day, so that men can go about their work." And that's why the tutu sings around 5 in the morning and the rooster around 6, and when they do, the sun rises. Also, it's Sa, death, that created the sun and moon and stars. And for that, and taking away his only child, he tells Alatangana that he owes him one. So as reparation, every time he needs it, he'll call upon one of Alatangana's children with his calabash rattle that they will see in their dream, and they have to obey it when they see it. Alatangana accepts, and that is why all men eventually die. So this story is a creation story, but it also explains the origin of death and the origin of the different human races, and it's clearly influenced by the colonial context in which it was written. That is obvious from the different attributes given to the races by Sa: intelligence and writing for white people and tools for black people. They are clearly a reflection of a society where the intellectual and political elites of the colony are white, while the workers, more or less free, are black. So Nonlo Nyenamu was telling this story about white people having intelligence and writing to Boimil Olas that was probably taking notes in order to transmit this story to a European white intellectual elite. So maybe you can see how the context in which the story was collected might have influenced the story. And you can maybe see how it reflects a hierarchy that stems from colonialism. Which is interesting, I think. It's more interesting that, death lived in mud. I'm pretty sure this context does more to explain the myth, but anyway. And the weight of colonialism is perhaps also felt in the Bushongo myth of Mbumba from what is now Congo in their 3rd episode this time. Note that the federation of tribes under the authority of the Bushongo king between the rivers Kasai and Sakuru was also called Kuba or Bakuba Kingdom, so the Bushongos are sometimes called Kuba by extension. Here is their creation myth as told by Crash Course. I'll overlay the text from Leeming so you can see that it comes from there too.
In the beginning, in the dark, there was nothing but water, and Mbumba was alone. One day Mbumba was in terrible pain. He retched and strained and vomited up the sun, After that, light spread over everything. The heat of the sun dried up the water until the black edges of the world began to show. Black sandbanks and reefs could be seen. But there were no living things. Mbumba vomited up the moon, and then the stars, and after that, the night had its light also. Still, Mbumba was in pain. He strained again, and 9 living creatures came forth. Last of all came man.
You'll notice again the similar wordings, but they left something out. Mike Rugnetta does echo one of Leeming's comparisons to an Egyptian creation myth.
Right? Notice that the creator god here is alone and also presumably male. This may suggest a patrilineal culture since creation occurs without a female presence. The story of Mbumba's creation from the Bushongo Bantu people in Africa is remarkably similar.
And even if Crash Course don't exactly repeat Leeming's claim that the myth of Mbumba suggests a patrilineal culture, that's where Leeming becomes a problem. Because first, the Bushongos are not a patrilineal culture. Leeming is guessing that they are patrilineal because of some lack of female characters, but apparently didn't even bother to check, because Torde explicitly says that descent only counts through the maternal line, which is the working definition of matrilineal. Also, at the end of the 19th century, this was one of the driving forces behind the demand for female slaves in the Kuba kingdom, because as foreigners, to quote Van Sinne, slaves had no lineage of their own, hence their children were incorporated into their father's lineage. These concubines thus boosted the growth of such a lineage compared to others, which then threatened to upset the local balance of power that existed between competing local lineages in favor of the enlarged one. It was this effect that encouraged all competing leading men to acquire as many concubines as they could obtain. As a result, the demand for slaves never abated. So they were pretty matrilineal? Maybe it's a little known fact and I shouldn't harp on Leeming for that. Okay, let's check with Google real quick. No, this is pretty well established, it's everywhere. In ethnology, family structure is like the first thing you learn about any given culture. It's even in the Encyclopedia Britannica entry for the Kuba Kingdom. For God's sake, Leeming couldn't even be bothered to check, he just guessed they were patrilineal. And second, I think Crash Course did use this passage from Leeming, that they read it at some point. That should be obvious from the similar sentences and the other examples, but interestingly, they omit the very next line. The fact that Mbumba is white suggests that this is a late myth, affected, like so much of African mythology, by the presence of the white race in colonial Africa. And indeed, after Mbumba creates the first animals, Leeming writes, "Last of all came forth men. There were many men, but only one was white like Mbumba." The story is so steeped in colonialism, he says, that their creator god is white. So again, let's look at the chain of transmission, shall we? Leeming is quoting Mircea Eliade, who is quoting a book by Maria Leach, who translated and adapted a 1910 report by E. Torde for an expedition that took place in 1907 to 1909. Again in French, because the Bushongos lived in what became Belgian Congo, a French-speaking colony. Torde and Joyce say, the story of the Bushongo starts with a cosmogony, and the beginning sentences remind neatly of the first verses of the book of Genesis. Like, even if Torde himself does not think so, maybe there's some Western influence there. And they indeed say that Mbumba has the likeness of a man, but is much bigger and white. By the way, if this is the source, nothing here says that the sand is black. Nothing, it's just sable, sand. Like, they don't mention the whiteness of the creator, but they invent the blackness of the sand along the way. That's pretty ironic. And the text is pretty explicit. Mbumba is vomiting a wide array of species, some of which will vomit other species afterwards, and then he vomited men. A big number of them, but there was only one who was white like him. His name was Lokoyima. And it doesn't stop there. It says the work of Mbumba was over. He called the 3 best men, Lokoyima, who was white, and Yele and Dumashwa, who were black. And he talked to them in these terms. You, Yele, you will be the leader of the Bangongo. You, Dumashwa, will be the leader of the Bangendi. But you, Lokoyima, you will be Chembekunji, meaning God on earth, leader of all mankind. And Yele and Dumashwa will pay you tribute. When he had spoken thus, he rose in the air and disappeared in the skies. In that way, Lokoyima became supreme leader of mankind. This myth is claiming that world dominance was given to a white guy by the god of the Bushongo who was conveniently white. And in that case, I think it can be argued that it's trying to explain white supremacy and the colonization of their land. By the end of the century, it could certainly be felt. In 1899, armed mercenaries from the neighboring Zapozap tried to extort slaves, rubber, and food from the Bushongo kingdom on behalf of the Congo Free State, and conducted a massacre when their demands were not met. As a result of such destabilizing factors, while in the 19th century reigns could extend over 30 or 40 years, there were 6 Bushongo kings in the year 1900 alone. In his reports, Torde duly notes that while the current Bushongo king laments the encroaching of white people on his land and the waning of his power, he has given up on fighting against them. The last wars and rebellions were done without much hope or conviction and without much support from the king. So it would only be fitting that their myth is explaining their powerlessness by an imbalance in creation. So if we admit that this Kono myth from Guinea and the Bushongo myth from Congo both try to rationalize white dominance in some way, it poses the problem of how old these stories are. Elements of the story could be older, but in that form they must have emerged after the arrival of European powers in Africa. For both of them, we have a terminus antiquum, the date at which they were recorded, 1909 and 1950. The earliest possible date would be, I think, the 16th century, where the slave trade and some empires, especially the Portuguese one, started to take hold in West Africa. But both Konos and Bushongos were in pretty remote areas. In the Guinea forestière, or forested Guinea, the Kono had a somewhat separate culture, and the river Kasai, delimiting Bushongo territory, was only explored by the Wisman expedition in 1884, and they couldn't get far into Bushongo territory, their information on them being mostly hearsay from other tribes. So if these stories do indeed reflect colonial hierarchies, my best guess would be the 1880s, with the scramble for Africa, the Berlin Conference, and the main exploratory and military expeditions from colonial powers, after which the Congo Free State was formed in 1885 and French Guinea in 1891. It could be earlier, but I'd say not much earlier. And why is it a problem? Nobody said that a myth had to be ancient, right? Well,
we're going to start by saying that a myth is a story, but it's a special kind of story that, for the purposes of this series, has 2 primary characteristics: significance and staying power. This means that the subject matter is about something important, something about how the world works, or how the world itself got going, how things came to be. And then there's staying power. These are stories that have survived centuries, sometimes millennia. And this is a testament to the deep meaning or functional importance of these stories to the people who hear and tell them.
And of course, since they are using the Big Bang or the Gaia hypothesis, they are not only talking about ancient myth, but I think that the average viewer will infer that those stories have been told for centuries. But if they are products of the colonial era, they might not even have been 50 years old when they were collected.
That said, I'm pretty sure that the Kono myth is reflecting colonial hierarchies, okay? It's pretty explicit, it's pretty out there. But I have serious doubts about the Bushongo one.
At first, like David Leeming, I was convinced that the fact that Mbumba is white suggests that this is a late myth, affected, like so much of African mythology, by the presence of the white race in colonial Africa. I was on board, and as such, the first version of this video was really shorter, but the patrilineal bit made me realize David Leeming didn't know what he was talking about, so I dug a little deeper. The more research I did, the more I thought about it, it seemed to me that the content of the myth and the chronology didn't check out. First off, Lokoyima is not the ancestor of white people this time. Actually, there are no white people in this myth, but he is the ancestor of the Bushongo royal line. The function of the myth is to legitimize the rule of the Nyimi from the Bambala tribe over the Bangendi and Bangongo tribes that seem to have been conquered and put under the authority of the Bushongos at some point. Chembe Kunji, God on Earth, is not a title bestowed on the white rulers to legitimize their reign, but a title applied to their first mythical kings, even if for current kings the term of Nyimi seems to be preferred. Lokoima is succeeded by his daughter Mbumba, which has a son, Woto, described as being of somewhat mixed race. So the whiteness of Lokoima's line is pretty quickly diluted. Also, in the Bushongo version of the myth, they say that Mbumba is an albino man, so it might not be linked with Europeans at all, since, albinos existed. Especially since the Bushongos had no contact with Europeans until the very end of the 19th century. In 1878, the German explorer Schut could only write that they were cannibals, relying on hearsay from a Luso-African trader. And while Antonio Ferreira da Silva Porto did reach Kampungu in 1880, it would take, again, the Wisman expedition along the river Kasai for a proper contact. In 1891, Wolf, a member of said expedition, would depict the Kuba kingdom as some sort of unadulterated ancient civilization in the heart of Central Africa. But, of course, as you probably realized when I mentioned these Portuguese traders, we cannot take this European fantasy of an untouched people for granted. To quote Vancina, it is entirely humbug. By the time of Wolf's visit, and contrary to his romantic picture, Cuba society had in fact been changing rapidly as the result of a significant influx of Luba slaves that had started more than 5 years before Wolf arrived and was to continue for almost another 20 years. They were not cut off the larger slave and ivory trade in which the Portuguese participated from the Angolan coast, so we should not exaggerate their isolation. But still, European incursions up to this point were of the utmost rarity. Mbeki, the Nimi that assumed power in 1890, still forbid, quote, anyone on pain of death to show any foreigner any road to the capital. So quite isolated, I'd say. And the chronology to me doesn't check out. Before 1885 they were pretty independent, and the story was collected around 1908, which leaves only 23 years for Mbumba to become white. They have a pretty solid oral tradition and a royal official charged with maintaining it, so it would be weird that such a change could happen so quickly. Belgian rule over the Congo was harsh, to say the least, and its brutality and cruelty might have been enough to alter these stories in such a short span of time. That's possible. That's a perfectly reasonable line of explanation. It's also possible that as more and more territory around the Bushongo kingdom was subdued by Europeans, the whiteness of Mbumba and Lokoima found its way into the myth, or that the whiteness was there but gained new meaning with colonization. I think it's open to interpretation. We don't know, or at least I don't know, and I think David Leeming and Crash Course don't know either. I welcome any further information if you know more about these stories, or if you want to correct me on my pronunciation, which is probably wrong and terrible. Please get in touch and we'll be happy to issue a correction that would only be fair. But whether it's the fruit of an ancient tradition or a consequence of European rule, one thing is for certain: Mbumba's whiteness is part of the story as it was told, as it was collected. You can't just get rid of it because you think it's extraneous. It was part of the story that was collected by Torde and on which you relied. And it was in Mayalich and it was in Leeming. So the problem is not really that the compilers don't include those facts, but that they get rid of the context and that Crash Course then don't know what to make of it. And even their animation team portrays Mbumba as black, which he is not in the story. I would understand the desire to avoid such long-winded discussions, but I'm not sure it was a conscious decision. I think it stems directly from the limitations of their sources, and that shows ultimately the problem with bite-sized mythology. To be clear, I think Crash Course Mythology can be a good series on the whole. We shouldn't judge it too harshly before it's finished, and we shouldn't expect more than an introduction to these subjects. They will probably give heed to schools of thought that I don't agree with at all, but even if they don't, they'll never completely satisfy a bitter scholar like me. And that's why I made this video, to add something, to discuss matters left untouched, not to take away something or argue it shouldn't exist. That said, what to conclude? Wait, is what to conclude a proper English sentence? Before editing, check the syntax and also maybe start by...
What am I getting at? I feel like I should make my main point clearer. That is, those two examples show us how the context in which a myth was collected can be enlightening, but also misleading. It's very tempting to interpret both those stories in the same way, that is, a consequence of colonial rule. But again, I think we should be careful with our interpretations, especially when we don't have a full knowledge of the context. My main point was that mythological accounts coming from colonial context come with a lot of problems that the people behind Crash Course are not necessarily equipped to deal with, even with the best intentions. And I want to make it clear that I'm not blaming them for colonialism, that would be weird, but that's really a wider problem in the field of, let's say, mythology. And maybe you've noticed that my main problem is not that they copied Leeming's book, but that Leeming's book is really bad. Like, some parts are fine, obviously, but some others are really messed up, bordering on gross incompetence. Maybe the more recent edition is better. I couldn't find it, which is ironic given I'm the one like, oh, do more research. Yeah. And those other books, from what I've read, don't seem as bad, I guess. In any case, a lot of mythologists have literary backgrounds, thus the impetus to collect stories, I guess. And I want to stress that there is nothing wrong with being interested in myth, but it becomes a problem, in my opinion, when it's all you're interested in. Hear me out, like a lot of students of myth only read books about mythology and are under the impression that from these stories, the deities involved, you can deduce many things on the societies that produced them. And Crash Course is certainly doing that to some extent. But it goes wrong, in my opinion, when the myth becomes the whole face of the culture in question. For a lot of people, the myth of Mbumba is all they will ever know about Bushongo culture. Like if you Google Bushongo, that's the only thing you find. Like it's one story collected by one guy at one point, but now it's all that matters about them, I guess. And Leeming just assuming that it suggests a patrilineal culture instead of, you know, checking, is a concentrate of everything wrong with this mindset. This mindset where you abstract myth of its context so you can make it into a nice little commodity that you can then exchange, compare and put into nice little catalogs. And by comparison, Crash Course does give some context, like they cite the Mayan Popol Vuh, they tell you Hesiod is a shepherd poet from like the 7th century BC, this is a 19th century translation from the Shatapatha Brahmana. They do give the source. Literate societies have the luxury of proper citation. As for African myth, well, they exist outside of history apparently. Kono and Bushongo are little more than names on a map attached to a story, with no timestamp whatsoever. Worse, when we find elements that could be explained by the historical context, or that clash with the historical context and therefore would require an explanation, like the whiteness of Mbumba for example, they are removed, to leave only the mythological parts. We're not interested in the actual human beings that produced these stories, but in some sort of shared human prehistory that we could go back to by comparing these myths and getting rid of anything explainable in them, to go back to an era where human thought was purely mythical. That might be a discussion for another day, but these attempts at rewinding history to get to some sort of original purity are always vain, because no matter how far back you go, you'll never find a contextless story. Another consequence of this line of thinking is that now that we have the story, we don't have to collect it more than once, because we'd risk having variants of it and thus more problems to interpret them. And now that they've come in contact with the West, maybe their story is corrupted by us and thus has no value because... Like there's the illusion that all these oral cultures evolve separately from one another, free from influences and history, creating a rich variety of stories. But the second we come in contact with them, later stories lose all value whatsoever, because they're not the true story anymore. I for one think that all stories are interesting, or at least it's more interesting to analyze those that actually exist, rather than the purer, original version that you made up in your mind. Of course, mythology is not the only way to get a shallow understanding of Bushongo culture, far from it. Like, since pretty much the Belgian conquest, there's been a whole market for Kuba art in the West, so a lot of people will only know these sculptures, which is not a lot better. And one of the major stories I could find in Western media about the Kuba Kingdom was a 1960 Time magazine article about how the Bakuba king has 800 wives, which became some sort of cliché that was copied down the line, because apparently that's the most important thing about them. But the impression I got while reading Leeming was that of a butterfly collector. Like, you see all these beautiful insects pinned down on the page and you want to ask, what about this butterfly? What does it eat? Where does it live? Is it still alive somewhere, or is this the last remnant of some ancient era? And they tell you, I don't know, I just put them on the page because they looked alike and pretty, and I get they are patrilineal. But to follow up on this bad metaphor, is the story of Mbumba still told today in some capacity? Well, I don't really know, because Leeming, Hamilton and the like don't really care, they're just happy telling the story. But the Bushongos are still a thing. The Kuba kingdom survived through colonial rule. There is still a Bushongo king today, and him in office since 1969. And as I understand it, he's still a respected figure in local politics in Congo. Like, just last month he addressed his condolences to the families of the 2 UN workers killed in the Kasai region while investigating weapons trafficking. In this context, I have no idea if that makes sense to treat this story as coming from some sort of remote antiquity. Maybe there are some people of Bushongo descent watching me right now and thinking that I'm completely wrong and that Leeming is right about everything, or that we are both completely wrong. That's a stronger possibility. And if you have any further information, please get in touch, because I didn't do that much research, and that's another problem: time. What I did here was by no means extensive research. I just went and checked the sources that these books are supposed to rely on, and it still took me quite a while to write this video, notwithstanding filming and editing. So I don't think that Crash Course can afford to research every example they use with such diligence. Leeming should, since he claims to be a specialist of myth, telling you everything about myth. He should, but Crash Course, it's not really their place. But still, the little amount of research I did led me to have a reasonable doubt about Crash Course mythology, and I'll keep it in mind while I watch their next videos. Thanks for watching.
We hope you learned something today. Don't hesitate to leave a comment if you think we got something wrong, or you have a question, or, well, a comment. We always like comments, and since we don't get a lot of them, we try answering them all. As the old saying goes, don't forget to share and subscribe, although be aware that we mainly do our videos in French, although we have another English episode where we look at the history of Samhain and Halloween. I think it's a really good episode, and furthermore, this time it was Antoine reading, and he has a way better pronunciation than me. I think about doing a separate channel dedicated to our English videos. That would make sense if we ever find an English-speaking audience. We hope that you, yes, you are this audience. At least we have a few videos planned in the future in English, and we hope to see you then. For all intents and purposes, in the description you will find a link to the script of this video, footnoted, with our references and links to the sources when they are available online. As for sources, I think I cited pretty much everything on screen or in the script. I mainly went back the chain of transmission. Leeming is partly on Google Books, as well as Uli Bayer and Hamilton. Hollas's books on Congo culture are kinda hard to find depending on where you are, and still under copyright, but Tordel's report Les Bushongo is on Gallica, the French National Library platform, and he published a sort of abridged translation of his travel there in English in 1925 on the Trail of the Bushongo that you can read on archive.org. I'll put a link to those in the script and the description. As for the Bushongo, as you've seen, we also used Van Sinne's book Being Colonized, the Kuba Experience in Rural Congo, which can give a little context. I'm not aware of in-depth analysis of these two stories, but I'd be glad to do a follow-up video if it comes to my attention, or if we get interesting comments. In any way, until then, don't forget to check your sources. And farewell.